Welcome to Ask a Therapist, a show where qualified therapists stop by to answer all your questions. Welcome to another episode of Ask a Therapist. This is a show by Legally Clueless Africa where you get to send in your questions, anonymous even, and we have a therapist or counselor come through and answer them. If you check out the show notes, there is a question form. Drop your question there and then stay listening to hear it being answered in one of our episodes. We're in our second season, which means we have another therapist answering your question. I mentioned before that I followed this particular therapist on social media, which is where I discovered him. He does and creates and shares incredible information via video that can help you along your healing journey. In fact, the most recent one that I watched had everything to do with shame, which is something I'm very interested in, especially in how shame is used to control us and how it can really eat us from the inside out. Anyway, his name is Aldo, and I knew with every video of his that I watched that I wanted to bring him on Ask a Therapist. So he's a therapist answering your questions this season, and he does all forms of therapy from individual to child therapy to family therapy. So after listening to him, if you want to reach out and book your sessions, all you have to do is in the show notes, hit him up on TikTok or on Instagram. It's as simple as that. And in this episode, if you're one person who has always been scared of starting therapy, or maybe you can't afford it just yet, trust me, this is the episode for you. And now, let's get right into answering all your questions. Aldo's back. And the question in this episode is, what do I do if I can't afford to go to therapy? Are there things I can do in the meantime to help me heal from issues I've experienced?
I'd say you begin to educate yourself. In the day and age that we live in, a lot of this information is out there. Now, not all of it is good. So now discernment kicks in just because, and saying this is funny because I can be a talking head on social media.
Yeah.
But just because somebody said it, it doesn't make it true. But I'd say become inquisitive. So you begin to ask the questions and be familiar with the information that there is and get your hands on a lot of it and let's just go through. Find the commonalities. And that's not to say, again, that it's 100% true. But the more commonalities you find, the more people you see which are in a similar place as you. And then you can see those kind of examples. And what that does is it reduces the feeling of isolation. Because as we were saying, when you're in a space and you feel it's only me, it feels like you're at sea by yourself drowning in the dark. And that's terrifying. But once you see, hey, there's one person there, there's another, actually there's a whole bunch of us, it's possible to get through this. Because there's a lot of people with similar lived experience. Just because I don't know them, it doesn't mean it's not there. So if you can't go for the sessions, familiarize yourself with as much information as you can, because it really, really helps. I've seen people out here who, I listen to some podcasts, usually if I'm in the gym or something, and you find yourself almost stopping in your tracks being like, oh my God, I feel like she was talking to me in that moment. And it's out there, but you just have to look.
I think that's so true. And the more you look, the more you exercise that discernment muscle, right? And you're able to weed through because it's not for me. Because if you only take the first thing you see, then you've self-diagnosed, you're going off a cliff somewhere, right? So the more you dig, the more you're like, I thought this sounded like something I'm experiencing, but the more I read, this is not quite it. Let me keep going, I think it's important to also have that. And the reason I say this is I remember telling my friend, I'm very aware, I have an anxious attachment style. I don't know much more, and you can almost draw lines directly to abandonment issues and you can draw lines. So I was telling my friend, there's some TikToks that are made for women who are healing or if you're in a relationship with a guy and they're talking about if he does this is what it means. I'm like, you have to be careful with me when you're telling me these things, because for me, it's if I was not aware of why am I having this thought and not aware of how can I catch it, if I took this as the gospel truth, I would be exhausted mentally. The anxiety would be out of this world. So I remember having that conversation, just saying it's so good to also know yourself as you're digging through these resources online, because some may just not be for you.
So even when doing things online, the thing I realize is that this can be really, really good. This is by no means all that you need. It is a very small part of the whole, and if it helps, that's great. You can now read up more. There's things I haven't covered. And so some people, because they want to package it very neatly, then say, here you go, this is all you need. That's not true. Because as much as it can speak to you, this person didn't manage to have a back and forth with you and really get to know who you are. So like I was saying previously, they serve a purpose, but it's a part of the whole. Not to say I've, watched these TikToks, I listened to this podcast, now I know completely. It's like, please understand, nobody knows completely. There's the more educated, or the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. But it's helping, I guess, within that frame of reference. And so by all means, absorb it, but realize that some things aren't true. Some things can be harmful. Like we were saying before, discernment is your friend, and you should always question. It's not rude to do so. It's not a bad thing to be inquisitive or to say, is that really true? Is that the way it really works? Because that it can safeguard you from some, and it's a strong word to use, but there's some pretty nefarious stuff out there where you listen and you're like, you can't jump on your platform and tell that to people. That can be dangerous because people assume that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
They assume that you're not trying to harm them. They'll take it in, and it can really send them off on not the best path.
What about for this particular person looking at wellness spaces, right? So in terms of wellness, it might not be as concrete and medical, but it's perhaps things that can help you maybe structure your day better. So like having a routine can really work wonders for your mind even. The food you eat can also do so much for you. I think a lot of times we jump to wanting to see someone who's a therapist, but there's day-to-day things you can do that can make you feel good. For example, there's this TikTok I came across this past week, and this guy was just sharing I don't even know what he does, but he said it was so wonderful. So you know how like if you're in the house, you've misplaced your keys, and you ask someone, have you seen my keys?
Yeah.
The first thing they'll ask you is,
Where did you last put them?
Where did you last put them? Or when do you remember having them? Right, I think is what he said. And he was like, perhaps you could do that when you're seeking happiness and joy and like good things in your life, is to ask yourself, when did I last have this happiness? What was I doing? To kind of help you figure out, is this the career for me when I remember that time I was happy doing this other thing, Is this the place I wanted to? And I just thought, oh my God, you are so wise. And so I think sometimes it may be, yes, spaces that are talking about therapy, but also because we spend so much time online, it could also mean looking at enriching spaces, even from a wellness type of.
That's true. And I'm really happy you said that, because even if you're doing work on the mind in and of itself, it's not nearly enough. It doesn't exist in isolation. We're not just like, floating consciousness. It's always in a body. And so those two things are linked. I'll often have sessions that we'll get into a lot of physical talk, like what are you actually doing? Because the mind affects the body and vice versa. It's like if you get a cold or something, you feel lousy. I feel terrible because your body is sick. And if you're getting into an episode, a depressive one, for example, you'll feel lethargic. You can't separate the two. So even if you're going to therapy, which is fantastic, don't neglect the other things. I laugh because simple things like exercise, it's a cheat code. I can't even list the amount of benefits there are. And exercise doesn't mean maximum intensity. Again, online, it doesn't mean some of these trainers who are out there who do stuff and you're like, I'm injured and I'm just watching this on my phone. Simple things. Walk. That in conjunction with the work that you're doing in therapy is going to get you so much further than if you're reading up, if you're going to therapy, doing all this stuff, but you're neglecting your body. You're not going to get to that place because the vehicle in which we reside in, it doesn't feel good.
Oh, I love that. I definitely will, in the show notes, put a link to a Legally Clueless episode where I got my doctor to come on, because she was the one who taught me that I was doing so much mind work And like my body was just like, whatever, catch up when you want. And I had to like restructure. I hate cooking, so I got someone to cook for me. And then I started walking every morning, and like you're just like, yes, we're all growing together. No one is getting left behind. So if you check out the show notes, there's definitely a link to that specific episode. It might help you. I hope this episode gave you insights that can help you on your healing journey. Remember to send in your questions via our question form. There's a link to it in the show notes. And if you want to book a one-on-one therapy session with Aldo, or maybe you want to book some for your kids or your younger siblings or the entire family, check him out on TikTok and Instagram. Links to those pages are in the show notes. Episodes like this go out every single Friday. Thank you so much for listening. That's all for this episode. If you have a question to ask a therapist, please drop it in our question form. A link to it is in the show notes. Catch you next week for the next episode of Ask a Therapist.